The blood dripping from the mountain man's knuckles onto the dusty floorboards of the general store was the first thing Eleanor Hartwell noticed when she finally stopped screaming. And in that moment of forced stillness, their eyes met across a room that smelled of gunpowder, fear, and something that would change both their lives forever. It was June of 1874 in the Montana Territory, and Eleanor had traveled from Boston 3 weeks prior to take up a teaching position in the small mining town of Copper Ridge. The journey had been arduous, filled with discomfort and uncertainty, but nothing had prepared her for the violence she had just witnessed. 3 men had burst into Morton's general store, where she had been purchasing fabric for curtains, demanding the day's earnings and waving pistols like they were extensions of their own rage. Eleanor had frozen behind a display of canned goods, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might crack her ribs. The mountain man had been in the back corner, apparently invisible to the robbers in their frenzied focus on the shopkeeper. Eleanor had seen him, though, in those first seconds before chaos erupted. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the light from the window behind him. His hair fell past his shoulders in dark waves that suggested he had not seen a proper barber in months, maybe years. His arms, visible beneath rolled shirt sleeves, were corded with muscle that spoke of a life spent in hard labor and harder living. His face was weathered, tanned dark by sun and wind, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days of beard growth. He looked like he had been carved from the very mountains that surrounded the town. When the youngest of the robbers had grabbed Eleanor by the arm and pressed a gun to her temple, using her as leverage to hurry the shopkeeper along, the mountain man had moved with a speed that seemed impossible for someone his size. The fight that followed was brutal and swift. The mountain man's fists connected with flesh and bone, with sounds that Eleanor would hear in her nightmares for weeks to come. He disarmed 2 of the men before they could fire a shot, sending their weapons skittering across the floor. The 3rd man managed to slash at him with a knife, opening a gash along his ribs that immediately began seeping crimson through his shirt. But the mountain man did not stop. He drove his elbow into the knife wielder's face, then followed with a punch that sent the man crashing into a shelf of dry goods. Within minutes, all 3 robbers lay unconscious or groaning on the floor, and the mountain man stood breathing hard, blood spreading across his side and dripping from his abraded knuckles. That was when Eleanor had started screaming, the delayed shock of nearly dying finally catching up with her. The sound that came from her throat was raw and animal, beyond her control. Her hands shook so violently that she could not clasp them together to still the trembling. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel, and at the end of that tunnel was all that blood, so much blood, pooling and dripping and staining everything it touched. The shopkeeper, a portly man named Harold Morton, was yelling for someone to fetch the sheriff. Townsfolk were beginning to gather at the door, drawn by the commotion, but the mountain man ignored all of it. He crossed the distance between himself and Eleanor in 3 long strides, and before she could even process his approach, his large hands were on her shoulders, steady and warm. "Look at me," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through her bones. "Look at my eyes, not the blood." But Eleanor could not stop looking at the blood. It was everywhere now, or so it seemed to her panicked mind. It dripped from his knuckles onto her dress. It spread across his shirt in a dark stain that kept growing. Her stomach lurched, and she thought she might be sick. "I need you to breathe," he continued, his grip on her shoulders firm but not painful. "Breathe with me. In through your nose, out through your mouth." Eleanor tried, but her breath came in short, rapid gasps. The edges of her vision were going gray. She heard him curse softly, and then one of his hands moved from her shoulder to the back of her head, guiding her face against his chest, against the part of his shirt that was not yet soaked with blood. His other arm came around her back, holding her upright when her knees began to buckle. "That is it," he murmured, and she could feel the words rumbling in his chest. "I have got you. You are safe now. Just breathe." Pressed against him like this, Eleanor had no choice but to match her breathing to his. His chest rose and fell in a steady, deliberate rhythm, and gradually her own frantic gasps began to slow. The screaming had stopped, though she could not remember when. The gray was receding from her vision. She became aware of other sensations, the solid strength of him, the smell of pine and wood smoke, and something else, something wild and clean that reminded her of the forest. Despite the violence he had just committed, despite the blood and the danger, she felt inexplicably safe in his arms. "There you go," he said after a long moment. "You are doing fine. Just keep breathing." Eleanor's hands, which had been fluttering uselessly at her sides, came up to clutch at his shirt. She held on like he was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly revealed itself to be far more dangerous than she had imagined. She had known the West was wild, but knowing something intellectually and experiencing it were two very different things. "Are you hurt?" he asked, pulling back just enough to look down at her face. His eyes, she saw now, were a striking gray blue, like storm clouds over the mountains. There was concern in them, and something else, something that made her breath catch for an entirely different reason. "No," Eleanor managed, her voice shaking. "I am not hurt, but you are. You are bleeding." He glanced down at his side, at the spreading stain, as if he had forgotten about it. This is nothing. I have had worse from a mountain lion that objected to me checking its trap." "Nothing?" Eleanor's voice rose, some of her shock converting into indignation. "That is not nothing. You need a doctor." "We do not have a doctor in Copper Ridge," the mountain man said, his tone practical. "Had one for about 3 months last year, but he moved on to Helena, said there was not enough work here to justify staying." "Then someone needs to stitch that wound," Eleanor insisted. She was recovering herself now, her practical Boston upbringing reasserting itself over the panic. "You will bleed to death otherwise." "I will stitch it myself," he replied, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "I have done it before, but first, I need to make sure you are steady on your feet. Can you stand on your own?" Eleanor realized she was still leaning heavily against him, still clutching his shirt. She forced herself to step back, to release her grip. Her legs felt like water, but they held. "I can stand," she said, lifting her chin in an attempt at dignity. "Good." He gave her a nod of approval that sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Then he turned to address the shopkeeper, who was trussing up the 3 robbers with rope while several townsmen looked on. "Morton, send for the sheriff. These 3 will need to be locked up proper." "Already sent Jimmy to fetch him," Morton replied. He looked at the mountain man with obvious respect. "You got here at the right time, Tobias. They would have cleaned me out and probably shot me for good measure." Tobias. So that was his name. Eleanor filed it away, not examining too closely why she wanted to know. "Just happened to be in town for supplies," Tobias said with a shrug that he immediately regretted, judging by the way he pressed a hand to his bleeding side. "I should see to this before I drip all over your floor any more than I already have." "You want to use my back room?" Morton offered. "I've got some whiskey that will serve to clean it out." "Obliged," Tobias said. He started toward the back of the store, then paused and looked back at Eleanor. "Will you be all right, miss?" Eleanor should have said yes. She should have thanked him for saving her life and let him go tend his wounds in private. But the thought of being left alone, even surrounded by townspeople, filled her with a sudden, irrational panic. "Could I assist you?" she heard herself asking. "I have some experience with nursing. I helped tend my brothers when they were ill." Tobias looked surprised, his eyebrows rising toward his hairline. "It will not be pretty," he warned. "Stitching is different from nursing a fever." "I know what stitching entails," Eleanor said, with more confidence than she felt. "And you cannot properly stitch your own side. The angle will be all wrong." For a moment she thought he would refuse. Then he nodded slowly. "If you are certain, I would appreciate the help." Morton led them to a small back room that served as a combination office and storage space. There was a desk covered in papers, several crates of goods waiting to be unpacked, and a narrow cot against one wall. Tobias sat on the cot and immediately began unbuttoning his shirt, his movements methodical, despite the blood and the pain he must have been feeling. When he pulled the shirt off, Eleanor had to consciously keep her jaw from dropping. She had never seen a man without his shirt before, not even her brothers. Tobias was built like the mountains he apparently called home, all broad shoulders and defined muscle. His chest was dusted with dark hair, and his arms looked like they could lift a full-grown horse. But it was the scars that really caught her attention. He was covered in them, a roadmap of violence and survival etched into his flesh. Some were thin and white with age, others more recent and still pink. The knife wound along his ribs was still bleeding, though not as profusely as before. It was a clean slice, about 6 inches long, deep enough to need stitching, but Not, Eleanor thought with relief, deep enough to have hit anything vital. Morton returned with a bottle of whiskey, a needle, thread, and some clean cloths. "This is all I have got," he said apologetically. "Will it do?" "It will do fine," Tobias said. He took the whiskey bottle and pulled the cork out with his teeth, then poured a generous amount over the wound without so much as flinching. The muscles in his jaw tightened, the only sign of pain. Eleanor took the needle and thread with hands that were steadier than she had expected. She had sewn countless embroidery projects, had mended more clothing than she could count. This was just sewing, she told herself, just needle and thread and fabric. The fact that the fabric was human skin was irrelevant. "I need to clean it first," she said, keeping her voice steady. She soaked one of the cloths in whiskey and approached him. "This will hurt." "Not the first time," Tobias said. He met her eyes and gave her a small smile that transformed his harsh face into something almost gentle. "Do what you need to do." Eleanor pressed the whiskey-soaked cloth to the wound, cleaning away the blood and dirt. Tobias's breathing hitched, but he made no other sound. His stoicism made her feel braver somehow, more capable. She worked methodically, cleaning the wound as thoroughly as she could, trying not to think about the warm, solid reality of his skin under her hands. "You said you have stitched yourself before?" she asked, partly to distract herself, partly because she was genuinely curious. "Many times," Tobias confirmed. "When you live in the mountains, you learn to be your own doctor. No one else is going to do it for you." "How long have you lived in the mountains?" "Most of my life. Been on my own since I was 16. He paused, then added, "That was 12 years ago." 28 then. Eleanor was 22 herself, hardly an old maid by Boston standards, but certainly approaching that designation by the frontier's more practical timeline. She threaded the needle, her hands steady now, focused on the task. "This will hurt," she said again. "I know." There was something in his eyes, some warmth that had not been there before. "I trust you." Those 3 words should not have meant as much as they did. Eleanor barely knew this man, but he had saved her life, and now he was trusting her to cause him pain in the service of healing. There was an intimacy in that, something profound that she could not quite name. She made the first stitch, piercing his skin with the needle and drawing the edges of the wound together. Tobias went very still, every muscle in his body tensing, but he did not pull away. Eleanor worked carefully, making each stitch as neat and even as she could manage. Her mother had always said she had a gift for needlework, a steady hand and an eye for detail. She had never imagined using those skills like this. "Where are you from?" Tobias asked after several minutes of silence. His voice was slightly strained but steady. "You're not from around here." "Boston," Eleanor replied, grateful for the distraction of conversation. "I arrived 3 weeks ago to take up a teaching position. The school board hired me through correspondence." "Long way from home." "Yes." Eleanor made another stitch, her focus absolute. But Boston felt too small somehow, too constrained. "I wanted to see the West, to do something meaningful." "Teaching is meaningful," Tobias said. "These mining towns, they need good teachers. Too many children grow up without learning to read or write. That is no way to live." Eleanor glanced up at him, surprised. "You can read?" "My mother made sure of it before she died," Tobias said. "Taught me to read, write, and cipher. Said education was the one thing no one could ever take from me." She was right about that. "I'm sorry about your mother," Eleanor said softly. It was a long time ago, but there was old grief in his voice, carefully contained. "What made you decide to come here specifically? There must be schools all over the West looking for teachers." "The position was available, and Copper Ridge sounded interesting." She tied off another stitch. "Also, I wanted mountains. I have always loved the mountains, though I had only ever seen them from a distance until now." "They are something, are they not?" There was warmth in Tobias's voice now, the warmth of a man talking about something he loved. "Different every day, different every hour, depending on the light. I've been living in them for 12 years, and I still find new places, new views that take my breath away." Eleanor found herself smiling as she worked. "Tell me about it, about living in the mountains." So Tobias talked, his voice a low, soothing rumble that filled the small room. He told her about his cabin, built with his own hands on the side of a mountain about 10 miles from town. He told her about the wildlife he saw daily, the elk and deer, the occasional bear or mountain lion. He told her about trapping in the winter, the silent white world of snow and ice and survival. He told her about the stars at night, so numerous and bright that it felt like you could reach up and touch them. Eleanor listened, enchanted, as her needle moved in and out, drawing flesh together, creating order from damage. She had never met anyone like Tobias before. The men in Boston had been soft, refined, concerned with social niceties and business dealings. Tobias was something else entirely, something wild and free and utterly genuine. What you saw was what you got, no artifice, no pretension. There was something incredibly appealing about that. "There," she said finally, tying off the last stitch and cutting the thread. "All done." Tobias looked down at his side, examining her work with a critical eye. "That is fine stitching," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "Better than I could have done myself, and neater too. Thank you." "You saved my life," Eleanor said, suddenly feeling shy under his regard. "Stitching a wound is the least I could do." Still, Tobias reached out and gently took her hand, the one that had been holding the needle. His hand was enormous compared to hers, rough with calluses, still stained with blood from the fight, but his touch was careful, almost reverent. "Thank you, Eleanor." She had not told him her name. He must have heard Morton use it, or perhaps someone else in the store. Hearing it on his lips sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold or fear. "You're welcome, Tobias," she replied, not pulling her hand away. They stayed like that for a moment, connected, something passing between them that was too new and fragile to name. Then voices from the main store intruded, and Eleanor reluctantly stepped back. Reality reasserted itself. There would be questions, statements for the sheriff, the general chaos that followed violence. "I should get back out there," Eleanor said, though part of her wanted to stay in this small room forever, away from the world and its demands. "Yes." Tobias reached for his shirt, then looked at the blood-soaked fabric with resignation. "I'm going to need to burn this." "Morton might have something you could wear," Eleanor suggested. "He sells ready-made shirts." "Probably not in my size," Tobias said with a wry smile. "But I will ask." They emerged from the back room to find the store full of people. The sheriff, a stocky man with the impressive mustache, was overseeing the removal of the 3 robbers, all now conscious and sporting spectacular bruises. Several townswomen immediately descended on Eleanor, asking if she was all right, offering sympathy and cups of tea. Eleanor accepted their kindness while trying to keep track of Tobias, who was speaking with the sheriff in low tones. "That was terrifying," said a woman Eleanor recognized as Mrs. Brennan, the banker's wife. "Those horrible men. Thank God Tobias Reed was here. That man is a force of nature." "He certainly is," Eleanor agreed, watching as Tobias pulled on a new shirt that Morton had found somewhere. It was slightly too small, stretching tight across his shoulders and chest, but it was better than nothing. "He does not come to town often," Mrs. Brennan continued, following Eleanor's gaze with knowing eyes. "Lives alone up in the mountains, only comes down every few months for supplies. Bit of a mystery, really, though everyone likes him well enough. He helped the Johnsons rebuild their barn last year after a fire, would not take any payment for it, and he brings fresh meat to the church sometimes for families that are struggling." Eleanor absorbed this information, adding it to the growing picture of Tobias Reed, a man who lived alone but helped his neighbors, a man who was clearly capable of violence but used it only to protect, a man who was far more complex than his rugged exterior might suggest. The sheriff finally made his way over to Eleanor. "Miss Hartwell, I am going to need you to give me a statement about what happened here today." "Of course," Eleanor said, dragging her attention away from Tobias. The process took over an hour. Eleanor had to recount everything she had seen, from the moment the robbers entered to the fight to the aftermath. The sheriff wrote everything down laboriously, occasionally asking clarifying questions. By the time he was finished, Eleanor felt drained, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. When she was finally free to go, she found Tobias waiting near the door. He had his supplies packed into a large canvas bag slung over his shoulder. "I was hoping to walk you home," he said when he saw her. "Make sure you get there safely." "That is kind of you," Eleanor said, warmth spreading through her chest. "But surely you need to rest. That wound—" "We'll be fine," Tobias interrupted gently. "And I will rest better, knowing you are safe." Eleanor could have pointed out that the town was perfectly safe now, that the danger had passed. but she did not want to. She wanted his company, wanted to extend this strange, momentous day just a little longer. "I am boarding with Mrs. Fletcher," she said. "The house is about 3 blocks from here." "I know the one," Tobias said. He held the door open for her, and they stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight. Copper Ridge was a small town, just a few streets of wooden buildings clustered around the mining operations that gave the town its livelihood. The mountains rose up on all sides, majestic and eternal, their peaks still capped with snow even in June. Eleanor had found the town charming from the first, a far cry from the bustling streets of Boston, but after the violence of the afternoon, it felt different somehow, less innocent. They walked in silence for a few moments, Eleanor very aware of Tobias beside her, his long strides shortened to match her pace. People they passed stared openly, and Eleanor knew the gossip would be flying through town by nightfall, the new schoolteacher walking with the mysterious mountain man. But she found she did not care. "Are you sure you're all right?" Tobias asked as they turned onto Mrs. Fletcher's street. "That was a terrible thing to experience, especially so soon after arriving." "I am well enough," Eleanor said, though she knew she would be replaying those moments in her mind for a long time to come. "Thanks to you. If you had not been there—" "Do not think about it," Tobias said firmly. "It did not happen. You are safe." They reached Mrs. Fletcher's house, a neat white structure with a well-tended garden. Eleanor paused at the gate, not quite ready to say goodbye. "Will you come to town again soon?" she asked, then felt her cheeks heat. That was forward, far too forward, but Tobias smiled, that small smile that transformed his face. "I was thinking I might make the trip more often, find excuses to come down from the mountain." "I would like that," Eleanor said softly. Then I will." He reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his rough fingers lingering for just a moment against her cheek. "Take care of yourself, Eleanor. You too, Tobias, and have someone check those stitches in a few days." "I will." He tipped his head to her, a gesture that was almost courtly despite his rough appearance, then turned and walked away, his long strides eating up the distance. Eleanor watched until he disappeared around a corner, then finally went inside, her mind whirling, her heart beating a strange, irregular rhythm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with possibility. Mrs. Fletcher was waiting in the parlor, her eyes wide with excitement. "My dear girl, I heard what happened at the store. Are you all right? And is it true that Tobias Reed saved you, and that you stitched his wound?" "All true," Eleanor confirmed, sinking into a chair with a sigh. "Well," Mrs. Fletcher said, settling in with the air of someone prepared for a long gossip session, "you have certainly made an impression on this town. And from what I saw out the window, Tobias Reed has made quite an impression on you as well." Eleanor could not deny it, so she did not try. "He is interesting," she said carefully. "Interesting," Mrs. Fletcher repeated with a knowing smile. "Yes, I suppose that is one word for it. He is a good man, Eleanor, despite his rough ways, or perhaps because of them. The West needs men like Tobias Reed." "Yes," Eleanor agreed softly, touching her cheek where his fingers had been. "I believe it does." That night, Eleanor lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier town settling for the night. She thought about blood and violence, about strong hands and gentle touches, about gray-blue eyes that saw too much. She thought about a man who lived alone in the mountains and stitched his own wounds without complaint. She thought about how his voice had sounded when he talked about the stars, and she thought, with a certainty that should have frightened her but did not, that her life had just changed in ways she could not yet comprehend. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. School was to begin in September, but there was much to do in preparation. The schoolhouse needed cleaning and organizing, books and supplies needed to be inventoried and ordered, and Eleanor needed to familiarize herself with the families whose children she would be teaching. She threw herself into the work, grateful for the distraction. But Tobias was never far from her thoughts. She found herself looking for him every time she went into town, her heart jumping at every tall, dark-haired man she glimpsed. But he did not come. Days turned into a week, then 2, and there was no sign of him. Eleanor told herself she was being foolish. He had probably forgotten all about her the moment he returned to his mountain. What was one afternoon of drama to a man who had clearly lived through countless dangerous situations? She was just a city girl who had needed rescuing, nothing special. But late at night, alone in her room, she remembered the way he had looked at her, the warmth in his voice when he said her name, the gentleness of his touch. Those memories felt real and significant in a way she could not dismiss. 3 weeks after the incident at the store, Eleanor was helping to organize a church social, a welcome event for her and the town's other recent arrivals. She was in the church basement with several other women, arranging tables and chairs, when someone called down the stairs. "Eleanor, you have a visitor!" Eleanor's heart immediately began to race. She climbed the stairs, trying to keep her expectations in check, but when she emerged into the sunlight, there he was. Tobias, standing beside a wagon loaded with firewood, looking slightly uncomfortable, surrounded by curious townspeople. "Hello," Eleanor said, aware that every eye was on them. "Hello," Tobias replied. His eyes met hers, and she saw relief in them, and something else, something warm and pleased. "I brought some firewood for the church. Father Murphy mentioned they were running low." "That is very generous of you," Eleanor said. "It is nothing." Tobias shifted his weight, uncharacteristically uncertain. "I also wondered if you might have time to check my stitches, make sure they are healing properly." The stitches. Of course. That was why he was here, the practical reason. Eleanor tried not to feel disappointed. "Certainly. We could use the pastor's office for privacy." They made their way into the church, aware of the whispers and speculative looks following them. The pastor's office was a small, neat space that smelled of old books and candle wax. Tobias closed the door behind them, and suddenly, the space felt much smaller. "How have you been?" Eleanor asked, her voice slightly breathless. "Well enough." Tobias began unbuttoning his shirt, his movements methodical. "The wound has been healing, no sign of infection, but I wanted you to check it, make sure your work held." Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak as he removed his shirt. In the weeks since she had last seen him, she had almost convinced herself that she had exaggerated his physical presence in her memory. She had not. If anything, her memory had been insufficient. He was all hard muscle and tanned skin, powerful and undeniably masculine. She forced herself to focus on the wound. The stitches were holding beautifully, the flesh knitting together cleanly. "It looks very good," she said, allowing herself to gently touch the skin around the stitches. "No signs of infection, and the healing is progressing well. You can probably have the stitches removed in another week or so." "Will you remove them?" Tobias asked, his voice quiet. Eleanor looked up at him, found him watching her with an intensity that made her stomach flip. "If you would like me to." "I would." He paused, then added, "I have missed you, Eleanor." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Eleanor's hand was still on his skin, and she became acutely aware of the warmth of him, the solid reality of his body under her palm. "I have missed you too," she whispered. Tobias reached up and covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his ribs just below the wound. "I stayed away on purpose," he admitted, tried to convince myself that what I felt that day was just the drama of the moment, the intensity of the situation. Tried to tell myself that you were too refined for a man like me, that I should leave you alone. And Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "And I failed." He lifted his other hand to cup her face, his rough palm warm against her cheek. "I thought about you every day, every hour. I tried to stay away, but I cannot." "I am glad you failed," Eleanor said, leaning into his touch. "I thought you had forgotten about me." "Forget you?" Tobias's thumb traced along her cheekbone, a gesture of such tenderness that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "Eleanor, I could no more forget you than I could forget how to breathe. You have been in my head, in my heart, since the moment I saw you." "Tobias," Eleanor breathed, and then he was kissing her. It was not a tentative first kiss, not gentle or exploratory. It was fierce and claiming, full of 3 weeks of longing and denial. Tobias's hand slid from her cheek into her hair, tilting her head back to deepen the kiss. His other arm came around her waist, pulling her against him, and Eleanor went willingly, her hands sliding up his bare chest to grip his shoulders. The kiss seemed to last forever, and no time at all. When Tobias finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I should not have done that," he said, though his arms remained around her. You deserve courting, proper attention, not some mountain man pawing at you in a church office. I wanted you to kiss me, Eleanor said firmly, and I want you to do it again. Tobias's eyes flew open, searching her face. Whatever he saw, there must have satisfied him because he smiled, that rare, transformative smile. You are full of surprises, Eleanor Hartwell. Good, Eleanor said, feeling bold and reckless and more alive than she had ever felt in Boston. I would hate to be predictable. They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other, the world outside the office door temporarily forgotten. Finally, reluctantly, Tobias stepped back and reached for his shirt. I should let you get back to your work, he said, buttoning the shirt with fingers that were not quite steady. But Eleanor, I need to know, is this something you want? Because I am not a man for casual affection. If we do this, if we explore what is between us, I need to know you are serious. Eleanor did not hesitate. I am serious, Tobias. I do not know exactly what this is, but I want to find out. Then I will court you properly, Tobias said, determination in every line of his body. I will come to town regularly, take you to socials and church and anywhere else proper. I will do this right. I would like that, Eleanor said, warmth spreading through her entire body. They emerged from the office to find several of the church ladies trying very hard to look like they had not been listening at the door. Eleanor felt her cheeks heat, but Tobias seemed unbothered. He simply tipped his hat to the ladies, gave Eleanor one last long look full of promise, and left to unload the firewood. Well, said Mrs. Brennan, her eyes sparkling with delight, I think we can safely say that the new schoolteacher is being properly welcomed to Copper Ridge. Eleanor laughed, unable to contain the joy bubbling up inside her. I think you might be right. True to his word, Tobias began courting Eleanor with a single-minded determination that was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. He came to town every few days, sometimes with legitimate business, sometimes with excuses so transparent that they made Eleanor laugh. He attended church services, sitting in the back pew and looking slightly uncomfortable in a clean shirt and his best trousers. He came to the town social and endured the gossip and speculation with good grace, his attention never wavering from Eleanor. They went on long walks, chaperoned by Mrs. Fletcher or one of the other respectable town ladies. Tobias told her about his life, about growing up the son of a trapper, about his mother's death when he was 12, about his father drinking himself into an early grave 4 years later. He told her about learning to survive alone, about the harsh beauty of winter in the mountains, about the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. Eleanor, in turn, told him about Boston, about her childhood in a comfortable but emotionally cold home, about her desire for something more than the life that had been mapped out for her. She told him about her love of books, her passion for teaching, her dreams of making a real difference in the world. You will, Tobias assured her. You already are. Mrs. Henderson was telling me yesterday how excited her children are about school starting, all because of you. They were sitting on a blanket by the creek that ran just outside of town, Mrs. Fletcher dozing discreetly under a nearby tree. It was late July, warm and sunny, the mountains rising around them in shades of green and gray and purple. I hope I can live up to their expectations, Eleanor said, trailing her fingers in the cool water. You will. Tobias said it with such certainty that Eleanor had to smile. You have a lot of faith in me. I do. He shifted closer, his shoulder brushing hers. You are the strongest woman I have ever met, Eleanor. You saw violence and blood. You had every right to fall apart, but instead you steadied yourself and stitched a wound. You left everything you knew to come out here and teach children who desperately need it. You have courage, real courage, and that is rare. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like that before, with such respect and admiration. Thank you, she whispered. Tobias took her hand, lacing his rough fingers through her smaller, softer ones. I am falling in love with you, Eleanor. I think I have been since that day in the store, but every moment I spend with you makes it more certain. Eleanor's breath caught. She looked up into his eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had haunted her dreams, and saw nothing but honesty and hope and a vulnerability that must have cost him dearly to show. I am falling in love with you too, she admitted. It terrifies me how fast this is happening, but I cannot seem to stop it. I do not want to stop it. Good, Tobias said, and kissed her, gentle and sweet despite the passion simmering beneath the surface. From that day forward, there was an understanding between them. They were courting with serious intent, moving toward a future together. The whole town seemed to know it, and Eleanor was subjected to constant advice and speculation. Most of it was well-meaning, though some of the older ladies seemed concerned about the match. "He lives in the mountains, dear," Mrs. Patterson said one afternoon when Eleanor was helping at the general store. "That is a hard life for a woman used to city comforts." "I am prepared for hard work," Eleanor replied, "and Tobias has offered to build additions to his cabin to make it more comfortable." "But you will be so isolated," Mrs. Patterson persisted. "What if something happens? What if you need help?" "Then Tobias will be there," Eleanor said firmly, "and we will still come to town regularly. I am not disappearing into the wilderness forever." But privately, Eleanor did wonder what her life would be like as the wife of a mountain man. She had never cooked over an open fire, never preserved food for winter, never dealt with the kinds of challenges that frontier life presented daily. Was she really strong enough for this? Was she capable of becoming the kind of woman Tobias needed? She expressed these fears to Tobias one evening as they sat on Mrs. Fletcher's porch, enjoying the cool air after a hot day. "What if I cannot do it?" she asked quietly. "What if I am not strong enough for that life?" Tobias was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "Eleanor, I have seen you face down armed robbers without falling apart. I have watched you win over this entire town in a matter of weeks. I have seen your determination, your intelligence, your courage. Do I think life in the mountains will be easy for you? No, it is not an easy life for anyone. But do I think you can do it? Absolutely. And more than that, I will be there with you. We will face everything together." "Together," Eleanor repeated, letting the word settle into her heart. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." Tobias took her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "And Eleanor, if you really hate it, if mountain life truly makes you miserable, we will figure something else out. We could build a house in town, or find some middle ground. Your happiness matters to me more than my preferences." Eleanor squeezed his hand, moved by his words. "I think I will love it," she said. "I think I will love anywhere, as long as I am with you." August arrived, hot and dry. The time came for Tobias to remove Eleanor's stitches. They met at the church again, though this time everyone seemed to know why and gave them space. Eleanor's hands were steady as she carefully clipped and pulled the stitches. The wound had healed into a thin pink line that would eventually fade to just another scar among many. "Perfect," Eleanor pronounced, running her fingers lightly over the healed skin. "You would never know anything had happened." "I will always know," Tobias said softly. "Every time I look at this scar, I will remember the day I met you, the day everything changed." Eleanor looked up at him, and the love in his eyes took her breath away. "Tobias, marry me," he said, the words sudden but not unexpected. "I know it is fast, I know we have only known each other a few months, but I have never been more certain of anything. Marry me, Eleanor. Be my wife. Build a life with me." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears, joyful tears. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." Tobias let out a whoop of joy and lifted her clean off her feet, spinning her around the small office while she laughed and clung to his shoulders. When he finally set her down, he kissed her with a thoroughness that left them both dizzy. "I do not have a ring yet," he said when he finally let her up for air, "but I will get you one, the finest ring in Montana territory." "I do not need a fancy ring," Eleanor said, touching his face with gentle fingers. "I just need you." "You have me," Tobias promised. "For the rest of my life, you have me." The wedding was planned for mid-September, after school started, but before the mountain weather turned too dangerous. Eleanor wrote to her family in Boston, though she knew the letter would likely arrive after the wedding itself. She was not sure they would approve anyway. Her parents had wanted her to marry well, to someone in their social circle. A mountain man would hardly be their idea of a suitable match. But Eleanor did not care. She had found something in Montana, something that had been missing in Boston. She had found purpose and adventure and love, real love, the kind that made her heart race and her soul sing. The schoolhouse opened on September 1st, and Eleanor threw herself into teaching with all the passion and dedication she possessed. She had 14 students, ranging in age from 6 to 15, each with their own challenges and strengths. She loved it, loved the moment when a difficult concept clicked for a struggling student, loved watching them discover the joy of reading, loved feeling like she was making a real difference. Tobias came to town more frequently now, helping to prepare for the wedding, working odd jobs to earn extra money, spending every possible moment with Eleanor. The town had fully embraced their romance, and the wedding had become a community event. Mrs. Fletcher was organizing the ceremony. Mrs. Brennan was arranging the reception. Even stern Mrs. Patterson had softened, donating fabric for Eleanor's wedding dress. Eleanor sewed the dress herself, working late into the night by lamplight. It was simple but elegant, cream-colored calico with lace at the collar and cuffs. She would never have worn such a plain dress in Boston, but here it felt right, practical and beautiful at once. The night before the wedding, Eleanor lay in bed unable to sleep. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Tobias Reed, wife of a mountain man, partner in a life she could barely imagine. She was not scared, exactly, but she was nervous, full of anticipation and wonder at how her life had transformed. There was a soft tap at her window. Eleanor's heart leaped. She crossed to the window and opened it to find Tobias standing below, barely visible in the darkness. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, leaning out. "It is bad luck to see the bride before the wedding." "I could not stay away," Tobias said, his voice low. "I needed to see you, to make sure you are truly ready for this." "Come up," Eleanor said impulsively. "Come up the trellis. We can talk properly." "Eleanor, that is hardly proper." "Since when have we been proper?" Eleanor countered. "Come up, Tobias, please." She heard his quiet laugh, and then he was climbing, his weight making the trellis creak alarmingly. Eleanor held her breath until he pulled himself through the window, landing lightly in her small room. "This is a terrible idea," he said, but he was smiling. "Probably," Eleanor agreed. She lit a candle, bathing the room in soft light. Tobias looked enormous in her small space, his head nearly brushing the ceiling. "But I'm glad you are here." They sat on her bed, careful to leave space between them, both aware of the impropriety but unable to resist this stolen moment. "Are you having second thoughts?" Tobias asked, taking her hand. "No," Eleanor said firmly. "Are you?" "Not even for a moment." He raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I just wanted to make sure you understand what you are getting into. My cabin is small and rough. The winters are harsh. You will be isolated from your friends in town for weeks at a time. It will be hard, Eleanor, harder than anything you have known." "I know," Eleanor said, "and I am ready. Tobias, I did not come to Montana to have an easy life. I came for adventure, for purpose, for something real. And I found all of that in you. I am not scared of hard work or isolation or harsh winters. The only thing I am scared of is living a life without you in it." Tobias's eyes shone in the candlelight. "How did I get so lucky?" he murmured. "What did I do to deserve you?" "You were yourself," Eleanor said simply. "Brave and honest and good. You saved my life, then trusted me to help save yours. You showed me a world beyond social conventions and expectations. You loved me for who I am, not who I am supposed to be." "I will always love you for who you are," Tobias promised. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch achingly tender. "Eleanor Hartwell, soon to be Eleanor Reed, you are the best thing that has ever happened to me. I swear I will spend the rest of my life making you happy." "You already do," Eleanor whispered, and then they were kissing, soft and sweet and full of promise. Tobias left before dawn, climbing back down the trellis and disappearing into the darkness. Eleanor watched him go, then finally crawled into bed, her heart full to bursting. The wedding took place at noon in the small church, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Eleanor walked down the aisle on Mrs. Fletcher's arm, since she had no family present to give her away. Tobias stood at the altar looking more nervous than she had ever seen him, dressed in his best clothes, his hair neatly tied back, his eyes locked on her. Father Murphy performed the ceremony with warmth and dignity. Eleanor and Tobias spoke their vows clearly, their voices steady despite the enormity of what they were promising. When Tobias slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Tobias kissed her with such joy and love that the entire church erupted in applause and cheers. The reception was held in the church basement, with tables laden with food that the townspeople had contributed. There was music and dancing, and Eleanor found herself passed from partner to partner, each person wanting to congratulate the new bride. But her eyes kept finding Tobias across the room, and every time their gazes met, she felt that now familiar thrill of love and desire. As the afternoon wore into evening, Tobias finally claimed her for a dance. He was not a practiced dancer, but he moved with the same confident grace he brought to everything else. They swayed together, Eleanor's head resting on his chest, his arms strong and secure around her. "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Reed?" he murmured into her hair. "Yes," Eleanor said, the word both an answer and a promise. They said their goodbyes amidst much teasing and well-wishes. Tobias had brought his wagon, and he had filled the bed with Eleanor's possessions and wedding gifts from the townspeople. He lifted Eleanor onto the seat, then climbed up beside her, taking up the reins. As they rolled out of town, Eleanor looked back once at the only home she had known in Montana. Then she turned to face forward, toward the mountains, toward the unknown, toward her future with the man beside her. The ride took several hours, following a rough trail that climbed steadily into the mountains. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold when they finally reached Tobias's cabin. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a creek running nearby, and a view of the valley below that took Eleanor's breath away. "It is beautiful," she said, meaning it. "It is home," Tobias said. "Our home now." He carried her over the threshold, making her laugh with the old-fashioned gallantry of it. Inside, the cabin was indeed small and rough, just one large room with a fireplace, a bed in one corner, a table and chairs, shelves for storage. But it was clean and well built, and there were signs of Tobias's efforts to make it welcoming. Fresh flowers in a jar on the table, new curtains on the windows, a rug on the floor that had not been there before. "You have been working," Eleanor said, touched by his thoughtfulness. "I wanted it to be nice for you," Tobias said, setting her down gently. "I know it is not much compared to what you are used to, but—" Eleanor silenced him with a kiss. "It is perfect," she said against his lips. "Absolutely perfect." That night they consummated their marriage in the narrow bed, discovering each other with tenderness and passion. Eleanor had been nervous, uncertain of what to expect, but Tobias was patient and gentle, mindful of her inexperience. By the time sleep finally claimed them, wrapped in each other's arms, Eleanor felt changed in a fundamental way, bound to this man not just by vows but by something deeper, something primal and unbreakable. The next weeks were a period of adjustment as Eleanor learned the rhythms of her new life. Tobias taught her how to cook over the fireplace, how to preserve food, how to read the weather and the land. Eleanor proved to be a quick study, her intelligence and determination serving her well. She made mistakes, of course, burned meals and ruined laundry, and once nearly got lost in the woods behind the cabin. But she learned from each mistake, adapted, grew stronger. Tobias, for his part, proved to be a patient and supportive husband. He never criticized her failures, only encouraged her efforts. He taught her to shoot, to fish, to identify edible plants. He shared his deep knowledge of the wilderness with her, opening up a world she had never imagined. Eleanor continued to teach, though the distance meant she could only make it to town a few days a week. On those days, Tobias would drive her down in the wagon, then return to pick her up in the evening. It was exhausting, but Eleanor refused to give up her students. Teaching was too important to her, too much a part of who she was. The first snow came in early October, earlier than Tobias had expected. They woke one morning to find the world transformed, everything blanketed in white. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the cabin, marveling at the beauty of it. "This is nothing," Tobias said, coming to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "By December, the snow will be over your head in places. We will be snowed in for days, maybe weeks at a time." "I am not scared," Eleanor said, leaning back against him. "I have you." "Yes," Tobias agreed, kissing the top of her head. "You do. Always." As autumn deepened into winter, Eleanor's teaching became impossible. The trail was too dangerous, the weather too unpredictable. Eleanor was disappointed but philosophical about it. She would resume in the spring. In the meantime, she threw herself into other projects. She sewed clothes and blankets, prepared food for the long winter ahead, even began writing a book about her experiences, thinking it might be interesting to people back east. The isolation that Mrs. Patterson had worried about turned out not to be the hardship Eleanor had feared. Yes, she missed her friends in town, missed the social interactions and the sense of community. But she found a different kind of fulfillment in her time alone with Tobias. They talked for hours by the fire, played cards and chess, read books aloud to each other. They made love and laughed and built a partnership that was unlike anything Eleanor had known was possible. One evening in December, during a particularly fierce blizzard, Eleanor stood at the window watching the snow swirl and dance in the wind. Tobias came up behind her, as he so often did, wrapping her in his warmth. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Giving up everything for this?" Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up into his face. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "Tobias, I was not truly living before I met you. I was existing, following rules and expectations, but I was not alive. Here, with you, I feel like I am finally the person I was always meant to be." "I love you," Tobias said, his voice rough with emotion, "more than I have words for." "I love you too," Eleanor replied, "more than I ever imagined possible." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other, the storm raging outside but unable to touch the warmth they had built together. Christmas came, and though they were alone, they made it special. Tobias cut down a small pine tree, and Eleanor decorated it with paper ornaments she had made. They exchanged simple gifts. Tobias had carved Eleanor a beautiful jewelry box from pine, inlaid with darker wood in an intricate pattern. Eleanor had sewn Tobias a new shirt, warmer than his old ones, with careful stitches and extra reinforcement at the seams. "It is beautiful," Tobias said, holding up the shirt with genuine admiration. "Eleanor, you have become quite the seamstress." "I had good motivation," Eleanor said, watching him try it on. It fit perfectly, and she felt a surge of pride at her handiwork. They made love in front of the fire that night, the Christmas tree glowing softly in the corner, and Eleanor thought she had never been happier. January and February were the hardest months, when the snow was deepest and the cold most bitter. There were days when they could not even open the cabin door because the snow had drifted so high. But they were prepared with plenty of food and firewood, and they made the best of it. Eleanor learned to appreciate the beauty of their isolation, the way the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them in the mountains. In March, the snow began to melt, and with it came a sense of renewal. Eleanor and Tobias made their first trip to town since before Christmas, and the welcome they received was overwhelming. Everyone wanted to hear about their winter to make sure they had survived all right. Eleanor reassured them that not only had they survived, they had thrived. She resumed teaching in April, delighted to be reunited with her students. Many of them had clearly missed school, and they attacked their lessons with renewed enthusiasm. Eleanor threw herself back into teaching with all her passion, but now there was a difference. Now she had Tobias waiting for her at the end of each day, ready to drive her home, ready to hear about her triumphs and frustrations, ready to hold her and love her. In May, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not been certain until the symptoms became unmistakable. She told Tobias one evening as they sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. "I'm going to have a baby," she said, unable to keep the joy and nervousness out of her voice. Tobias went very still. Then he turned to her, his eyes wide. "A baby? Eleanor, are you certain?" "As certain as I can be," Eleanor said. "I think it will be born in late autumn, probably October or November." Tobias let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled her into his arms. "A baby," he repeated, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, though she could feel the answer in the way he held her. "Happy?" Tobias pulled back to look at her, and Eleanor saw tears on his face, tears of pure joy. "Eleanor, I am beyond happy. I am terrified and thrilled and grateful and a dozen other things I do not have words for. A baby, our baby." They held each other as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. A baby, Eleanor thought. a new life, a new adventure, a new chapter in the story they were writing together. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Eleanor found the heat of summer harder to bear than usual. Tobias was almost comically protective, insisting she rest more, refusing to let her lift anything heavy, worrying over every little discomfort. Eleanor found it endearing, even when it was slightly annoying. She taught through August, then reluctantly agreed to take a leave of absence as her pregnancy advanced. The town ladies threw her a baby party, showering her with gifts and advice. Mrs. Fletcher knitted tiny booties. Mrs. Brennan contributed a beautiful cradle that her own children had used. Even stern Mrs. Patterson softened, presenting Eleanor with a handmade quilt for the baby. "You have done well for yourself," Mrs. Patterson told Eleanor at the party. "That man loves you something fierce, and you have adapted to this life better than I ever would have predicted. You are going to be a fine mother." Eleanor was touched by the words, by the acceptance and warmth of the community. She had made a life here, a real life, surrounded by people who cared about her. The baby came in early November, during the first snowfall of the season. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Eleanor was certain she could not do it, could not endure another contraction, another wave of pain. But Tobias was there, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, murmuring encouragement and love. Mrs. Fletcher, who had experience as a midwife, guided Eleanor through the process with calm competence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Eleanor heard a baby's cry, thin and outraged and perfect. "It is a boy," Mrs. Fletcher announced, placing the tiny squirming infant on Eleanor's chest. "You have a son." Eleanor looked down at the baby, at his tiny red face and waving fists, and felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." Tobias was crying openly now, staring at his son with an expression of awe and terror and overwhelming love. "He is perfect," he said hoarsely. "Eleanor, he is perfect." "He is," Eleanor agreed, exhausted and elated in equal measure. They named him Thomas after Tobias's father, with the hope that he would have the good qualities without the demons that had plagued his grandfather. Thomas Reed, born in a cabin in the Montana mountains, his first breaths filled with the clean air of the wilderness. The first weeks with a newborn were exhausting beyond anything Eleanor had imagined. Thomas needed to be fed constantly, changed constantly, soothed constantly. Eleanor was sleep-deprived and overwhelmed, her body still recovering from childbirth. But Tobias was there, sharing the load, taking the baby so Eleanor could rest, walking the floor at night when Thomas could not be consoled. They were a team, partners in parenthood, as they were partners in everything else. As winter settled in again, they adjusted to their new normal. Eleanor would nurse Thomas while Tobias read aloud from books or newspapers he had brought from town. They would take turns holding the baby while the other cooked or cleaned or tended to the endless tasks of survival. It was hard, harder than Eleanor could have imagined, but it was also filled with moments of pure joy. Thomas's first smile, his first laugh, the way his tiny hand would curl around Eleanor's finger. The expression on Tobias's face when he held his son, wonder and love and fierce protectiveness, all mingled together. Spring came again, and with it, a sense of new beginning. Thomas was growing, becoming more alert and interactive. Eleanor began to think about returning to teaching, at least part-time. She missed her students, missed the sense of purpose that teaching gave her. They made it work. Eleanor taught 3 days a week, bringing Thomas with her. The students were enchanted with the baby, and Eleanor discovered that having an infant in the classroom actually enhanced her teaching. The younger children loved helping to care for Thomas, and Eleanor used the baby to teach lessons about responsibility and gentleness. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of Thomas's growth. He took his first steps. He spoke his first words. He grew from an infant to a toddler to a little boy, curious and adventurous and fearless. Eleanor had another baby, a daughter they named Sarah when Thomas was 3. Then another son, James, 2 years after that. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family. Tobias added rooms, a proper bedroom for Eleanor and himself, a loft where the children slept. He built furniture, carved toys, created a home that was comfortable and full of love. Eleanor continued to teach, though she scaled back her hours to focus on her children. She discovered that she loved motherhood, loved watching her children grow and learn and develop their own personalities. Thomas was serious and thoughtful, much like his father. Sarah was bright and talkative, with Eleanor's love of books. James was wild and adventurous, always getting into mischief. Tobias thrived as a father. He taught the children to fish and hunt, to read the signs of the weather, to respect the wilderness. He was patient and firm, loving but disciplined. Eleanor would often find him with the children, telling them stories or teaching them to carve or simply holding them close. The protective instincts that had drawn her to him in the first place were now focused on their children, and she loved him even more for it. The town of Copper Ridge grew over the years, evolving from a rough mining camp into a more established community. More families arrived, more businesses opened, a proper school building was constructed. Eleanor became the head teacher, respected and valued by the entire community. Tobias, while still spending most of his time in the mountains, became known as someone you could rely on in a crisis. He helped build houses, rescued lost hunters, provided meat for families in need. He was respected, even admired, no longer the mysterious mountain man, but a valued member of the community. Eleanor's relationship with her family in Boston remained distant but civil. She wrote letters, sent photographs when a traveling photographer came through town. Her parents never fully approved of her choices, but they eventually accepted them. When Thomas was 5, Eleanor's younger sister Emily came to visit, ostensibly to see the West, but really to understand what had drawn Eleanor to this wild place. Emily stayed for a month, and by the end of it, she understood. She saw the love between Eleanor and Tobias, the strength of their partnership. She saw the community they had built, the life they had created. She saw that Eleanor was truly happy, more genuinely content than she had ever been in Boston. "I was wrong about you," Emily told Eleanor on her last night in Copper Ridge. They were sitting on the porch of the cabin, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I thought you were running away, fleeing from something, but you were running toward something, were you not? Toward this life, toward Tobias, toward the person you were meant to be." "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "I was." "I envy you," Emily admitted. "You have something real here, something authentic. All the social niceties and expectations in Boston, they seem so hollow now." Eleanor took her sister's hand. "Then find your own adventure, Emily. Find what makes you come alive." Emily returned to Boston, but she carried a piece of the West with her, and Eleanor suspected her sister would never be quite the same. Over the years, Eleanor received letters telling of Emily's own rebellion, her refusal to marry the man their parents had chosen, her decision to become a nurse, her eventual marriage to a doctor who shared her passion for helping people. The West had changed Emily, even in a month, had shown her what was possible when you chose your own path. The years continued to roll by, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. There were hard times, winters when food was scarce, summers when drought threatened the valley. There was illness, accidents, the constant dangers of frontier life. But there were also births and weddings, harvests and celebrations, the slow, steady building of a life and a legacy. Thomas grew into a young man, tall and strong like his father, with his mother's intelligence and love of learning. He decided to pursue law, traveling to Helena to apprentice with an attorney. Eleanor was proud, though she missed him terribly. Sarah became a teacher herself, taking over some of Eleanor's classes and discovering the same passion for education that her mother had found. She was courted by a young engineer who had come to help build a railroad spur to Copper Ridge, and Eleanor watched her daughter fall in love with the same helpless intensity she remembered from her own courtship. James remained wild and restless, disappearing into the mountains for weeks at a time, following in his father's footsteps. He talked about becoming a guide, about showing other people the beauty and wonder of the wilderness. Eleanor and Tobias watched their children grow and leave, felt the cabin become quieter, the days less hectic. It was bittersweet, this empty nest, but there was also a sense of accomplishment. They had raised 3 strong, capable, kind human beings. They had given them roots and wings, had taught them to be independent while knowing they always had a home to return to. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Tobias took Eleanor on a trip up to a high meadow he had discovered years before, but never shown her. It required a full day's ride, but Eleanor had maintained her strength and stamina over the years, and she was up for the adventure. The meadow was breathtaking, a sea of wildflowers stretching toward snow-capped peaks, a crystalline lake reflecting the sky. They made camp there, just the two of them, and sat by a fire as night fell. 20 years, Tobias said, pulling Eleanor close against his side. It does not feel possible. No, Eleanor agreed, resting her head on his shoulder. It feels like yesterday that I was stitching your wound in Morton's store, and it also feels like a lifetime ago, like we have lived several lifetimes together. Would you change anything? Tobias asked. If you could go back, knowing everything that would happen, would you make the same choices? Eleanor did not hesitate. Every single one. Tobias, these 20 years with you have been the best of my life. Hard, yes. Challenging, absolutely. But also filled with more love and joy and purpose than I ever imagined possible. You gave me this life, this incredible, wild, beautiful life, and I would not trade a single moment of it. I am the one who should be grateful, Tobias said, his voice rough with emotion. You took a chance on a rough mountain man, gave up everything comfortable and familiar, adapted to a life that would have broken most people. You gave me children, a family, a reason to be more than I was. Eleanor, you made me better. You made me whole. They made love under the stars that night, their bodies familiar and beloved after 20 years of marriage. And as Eleanor lay in Tobias's arms afterward, listening to his steady heartbeat, watching the stars wheel overhead, she thought about that day in Morton's store, the blood and the fear, and the moment their eyes had met across the chaos. She had not known then that she was looking at her future, at the man who would become her everything. But some part of her must have recognized him, must have known that he was important, that he would change everything. Thank you, she whispered into the darkness. For what? Tobias murmured sleepily. For seeing me that day, for holding me steady, for falling in love with me, for everything. Eleanor, Tobias said, pulling her closer, I should be thanking you. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, the only thing that matters. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, the mountains standing eternal watch around them. The years continued, marked by the gradual graying of hair, the appearance of wrinkles, the slowing of steps that had once been quick and sure. Thomas married and gave them grandchildren. Sarah did the same. James remained unmarried but happy, a fixture in the mountains, occasionally bringing them pelts or venison, always with stories of adventure. Eleanor eventually retired from teaching, though she remained active in the community, mentoring younger teachers, organizing reading programs, serving on various committees. She wrote her book about the early days in Montana, and to her surprise, it was published back east and became moderately successful. She received letters from women all over the country, thanking her for showing them that women could be strong, could choose unconventional paths, could thrive in the wilderness. Tobias's hair turned silver, his face became more weathered, but he remained strong, still capable of the hard physical labor that mountain life demanded. He was a fixture in Copper Ridge now, a living legend, the man who had tamed the wilderness and saved the schoolteacher. Children whispered about him with awe. Adults sought his advice and assistance. He had become, without seeking it, a pillar of the community. But to Eleanor, he was simply Tobias, her husband, her partner, her love, the man who had held her steady all those years ago when she saw his blood, and who had continued to hold her steady through every challenge and triumph since. They celebrated their 30th anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren, the cabin bursting with life and love. Eleanor looked around at all the faces, at the family they had created, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That night, after everyone had finally settled down to sleep, Eleanor and Tobias slipped out onto the porch. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant overhead, the mountains dark shapes against the sky. When I came to Montana, Eleanor said quietly, I was looking for adventure, for purpose, for something more. And I found it, Tobias. I found everything I was looking for, and so much more. I found you. And I found you, Tobias replied, taking her hand. His hands were still rough, still marked with calluses and scars, including the thin white line on his ribs from that long-ago knife wound. The girl who did not fall apart, who stitched my wound and stole my heart in the same afternoon. I love you, Eleanor said, the words as true and powerful as they had been 30 years ago. I will always love you. I love you too, Tobias said, pulling her close. Until the mountains crumble and the stars fall, I will love you. They stood like that, wrapped in each other's warmth, looking out at the land they had made their own. The wild Montana territory that had seemed so foreign and frightening to a Boston girl all those years ago now felt like the only home she'd ever truly had. Here, in these mountains, with this man, she had found her place, her purpose, her joy. The years ahead would bring more changes, inevitable losses, the slow march toward the end that awaited everyone. But Eleanor did not fear it. She'd lived fully, loved completely, built something lasting. Her children carried forward the values she and Tobias had instilled. Her students, now grown with children of their own, remembered her lessons. The community she had helped to build would endure long after she was gone. But those thoughts were for another day. Tonight, she was content to stand here with Tobias, feeling his strength and warmth, counting her blessings under the Montana stars. They had built a good life together, she and her mountain man, a life of love and courage and partnership, a life that had begun with blood and fear and stitches, but had grown into something beautiful and enduring. Come on, Tobias said finally, leading her back inside. It is getting cold. Eleanor went willingly, hand in hand with the man who had saved her life, and then filled it with meaning. The cabin was warm and full of the people they loved most. Outside, the mountains stood eternal, witness to their story, guardian of their legacy. And in that moment, wrapped in Tobias's arms as they lay down to sleep, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice all those years ago. She had seen his blood, had held steady, had fallen in love, and in doing so she had found her home, her heart, her forever. The end.